If you've ever driven through the southwestern part of the United States, you may have noticed the vast and dramatic landscape. Towering red rocks dominate the horizon. The land is dry and the climate is even drier. And you might think to yourself, how could anyone live here? And yet somehow a sophisticated society not only lived here but thrived here for hundreds of years. From around 550 to 1300 CE, somewhere between 20,000 to 70,000 people lived in the region now known as the Four Corners, specifically Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. These people were the Ancestral Puebloans, also known as the Anasazi. Now the word Anasazi was actually a Navajo term meaning ancient enemies, and it was used to describe these people because the Navajo believed the Anasazi raided their settlements. However, because the Navajo came to the area relatively late compared to the Anasazi, they would have been more likely calling them ancient people than ancient enemies. Nowadays, scholars prefer the term Ancestral Puebloans because it acknowledges that modern Pueblo tribes are their descendants. The Ancestral Puebloans were an advanced society that developed impressive technologies and built remarkable architecture. But by 1300 CE, they had vanished. So who were the Ancestral Puebloans? What did they leave behind? And why did they disappear? Let's find out. The Ancestral Puebloan culture thrived in the American Southwest from about 550 to 1300 CE. Although the Ancestral Puebloans covered a large geographic area, archaeologists divide them into three general regions based on location and cultural differences. To the north were the Ancestral Puebloans living in the San Juan Basin, which encompasses parts of present-day Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah. To the south were the Mogollon culture located in the western part of New Mexico, and along the Rio Grande were the Ancestral Puebloans known as the Mesa. Each of these cultures were made up of many smaller communities, but the largest of these communities were what we would call cities today. In fact, some of these cities rivaled the great cities of the ancient world in terms of size and complexity. For example, the city of Chaco Canyon contained around 20 major buildings and over 500 rooms built around a central plaza, and it's estimated that around 2,000 people lived there at its peak in the 9th century. Likewise, the city of Mesa Verde contains over 600 rooms built into the sides of cliffs, and it housed around 2,000 to 5,000 residents. Although each community was unique, all Ancestral Puebloan cultures shared common features such as their architecture, religion, and art style. For example, the architecture of Ancestral Puebloan homes were made from stone and were either above ground or built into caves. Some homes were round and others were rectangular, but eventually rectangular homes became the norm. Along the walls of many homes were alcoves, which were shelves where baskets and pottery could be stored out of reach of animals. And throughout the region, Ancestral Puebloan communities built kivas, which were round rooms that were used for religious ceremonies. As mentioned earlier, the Ancestral Puebloans were distributed across a large area, but it was until around 750 CE that they began to build large multi-story buildings in monumental architecture. During this time, they were also growing crops like corn, beans, and squash, as well as hunting, small game, and gathering wild plants, and their society was organized into clans, which were groups of families with a common ancestor. Each clan specialized in a particular craft or skill, such as pottery, weaving, or farming, and clan members cooperated to ensure everyone had food and other necessities. This cooperation allowed the Ancestral Puebloans to support large populations in areas that we would think are uninhabitable today. However, by 1300 CE, most of the Ancestral Puebloan sites were abandoned. But before we talk about why, let's look at some of the most impressive sites left behind by the Ancestral Puebloans. Chaco Canyon is located near the northwest corner of New Mexico in an area known as the Chaco Culture National Historical Park. It covers 45,000 acres and includes 5 major archaeological sites. The name Chaco comes from the Spanish word checo, which means gully or ravine, and it's fitting because Chaco Canyon is located within a canyon. But the Ancestral Puebloans didn't call it Chaco. Instead, they called it Wukin Shingle, which roughly translates to the place of the grey rocks. And indeed, much of the canyon walls are made of grey shale. In addition to being surrounded by natural beauty, Chaco Canyon was also strategically located in the center of a large network of roads. Chaco Canyon was first occupied around 850 CE and reached its peak between 900 and 1150 CE. It was probably a ceremonial center for many surrounding communities and was likely used for trade. There are 15 major great houses within the park, and the largest is Pueblo Bonito, which contains 800 rooms spread across 35 acres. Archaeologists believe around 2,000 people lived in Chaco Canyon at its peak. Also scattered throughout Chaco Canyon are dozens of smaller buildings and petroglyphs, which are symbols and designs carved into rocks. Mesa Verde is another impressive ancestral Puebloan site located in southwestern Colorado. However, unlike Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde was a fortified settlement. In fact, it's one of the most famous examples of cliff dwellings in America. The name Mesa Verde comes from the Spanish language and means green table, and it refers to the green vegetation on top of the red sandstone cliffs. The earliest inhabitants of Mesa Verde arrived around 550 CE and initially lived in pit houses, which were rounded dwellings that were dug into the ground. As the population grew, the ancestral Puebloans built more permanent above-ground homes. By the 11th century, however, the ancestral Puebloans began building their famous cliff dwellings, which consisted of rooms that were built into the niches of cliffs. They constructed these dwellings using stone and mortar, and they often built them on top of older structures, creating multi-story buildings. Some cliff dwellings included kitchens and storage areas built at ground level. Others had circular towers that may have served as well. Archaeologists believe Mesa Verde was home to around 2,000 to 5,000 people during its peak, between 1250 and 1300 CE, and it was continuously inhabited until around 1500 CE. Today, both Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde are UNESCO World Heritage Sites and are open to the public for tours and educational programs. You can explore the ancient ruins and learn about the fascinating history of the ancestral. As previously mentioned, the ancestral Puebloans were a thriving culture with impressive architecture and societal organization. But by 1300 CE, the majority of their settlements were abandoned. No one knows exactly why this happened, but most experts agree it was due to a combination of factors. One theory is that a severe drought caused the collapse of their society. The ancestral Puebloans lived in a environment and their society depended on the little rainfall the region received. Unfortunately, sometime around 1275 CE, the climate changed and a megadrought swept across the American Southwest. Crops failed, water holes dried up, and the ancestral Puebloans had to migrate in search of food and water. Another theory is that the ancestral Puebloans overused their resources. As their population grew, they put increasing pressure on the environment. They cleared more land for farming, hunted more game, and gathered more plants. Eventually, they may have reached a point where the environment couldn't sustain them, and their society began to crumble. Yet another theory is that conflict between neighboring societies caused the decline. As the ancestral Puebloans grew in size and prosperity, they likely came into conflict with other Native American tribes, who also wanted the limited resources. Warfare may have depleted their population and disrupted their way of life. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the ancestral Puebloan culture is that they left no written records behind. All that we know about them comes from the archaeological record, which is mostly material culture like pottery, tools, and buildings. This makes studying them extremely difficult since we can't decipher their language or read their literature. What we do know comes from the artifacts left behind and comparisons with their descendants, the modern Pueblo tribes. Through studying their material culture, archaeologists have learned that the ancestral Puebloans were highly skilled craftsmen. They wove intricate baskets and textiles, crafted detailed pottery, and built remarkable architecture. In addition, they kept domesticated animals like dogs and turkeys, and grew crops like corn, beans, and squash. Their architecture is perhaps the most impressive aspect of their culture. They built great houses, ceremonial structures, and cliff dwellings that showcase their ingenuity and skill. They also aligned many of their structures with astronomical events, showing a sophisticated understanding of astronomy. Today, the ancestral Puebloans are remembered as a highly advanced and innovative culture. They left behind a rich legacy of material culture that continues to fascinate and inspire people today. Their architecture is particularly remarkable and has influenced many modern architects and designers. In addition, their art and pottery are highly prized by collectors and museums. Although the ancestral Puebloans are no longer with us, their legacy lives on in the modern Pueblo tribes and in the awe-inspiring ruins that dot the American Southwest. Now check out, why did the Mayans disappear? Or click this other video instead.